Hello, Adolfo from Portainer here, and today I'm going to talk about Kubernetes features configuration with Portainer and the importance of a proper setup. Because Portainer is a multi-user platform, it allows the admin to set the boundaries within which the Portainer users are allowed to operate. And here I'm going to show you how to set up these boundaries. Right. Right after you define an admin user and connect Portainer to your Kubernetes cluster, you'll see that Portainer is going to send you to this page, the Kubernetes features configuration page. And I'm going to start with networking. Here we have two features, load balancer and Ingress Controller. Please make sure you have these installed before touching the settings. If you do not have any of these installed or both of them installed on your Kubernetes cluster, do not touch the respective settings. Just leave them as they are. In my case, I do have a load balancer, which is Metal LB, installed on my Kubernetes cluster, and I also have an Ingress controller, which is the Nginx Ingress controller. Currently, we only support Nginx and traffic for Ingress controllers. It's also important to put in the proper Ingress class here to make sure you're not going to have any issues when you use your Ingress controller on your applications. And you can see here that if I type in Nginx, Portainer is going to detect that the Ingress class is called Nginx and set the type accordingly. Same thing goes for traffic. Now, in my case, I'm using the Micro K8 Kubernetes distribution with Portainer here. And the Ingress class is actually called public, which Portainer does not understand which type it is, so I have to define this here manually. So again, it's important you understand and know the Ingress class name for the Ingress controller that you're using here on your Kubernetes cluster to make sure this will run properly with your applications. Right, security. Restrict access to the default namespace. This feature is only available on the Portainer Business Edition here. So what happens is that you cannot apply a quota to the default namespace. So to save yourself from having users deploying apps with no constraints and potentially causing unintended issues, it's best to force the use of specific namespaces where quotas can be enforced. This is why we have this option here under the Portainer Business Edition. Right, resources and metrics. Allow resource overcommit. Okay, so Kubernetes allows you to assign more resources to namespaces than what you have in your cluster, which is fine until the apps that are deployed start using up all of your resources. So in order to prevent unexpected out-of-memory issues or CPU issues, you should consider disabling resource overcommit and also consider reserving some capacity for your system services. So because again, this is a Portainer Business Edition feature, I'm going to show you here how it works. So if I disable allow resource overcommit, not only I restrict the use of the resources within the range that is available in my Kubernetes cluster, I can also reserve a percentage of the resources to my Kubernetes cluster. In this case, the suggested amount is 20%. But then you should define that yourself to make sure you're happy with whatever your configuration you have for your Kubernetes cluster. All right, enable features using metrics server. So if you installed the metrics server on your Kubernetes cluster, make sure to enable this here, and that is also available here in your Portainer Business Edition to make use of the auto-scaling features of your Kubernetes cluster. Right, available storage options. Here you will see a list of all the storage classes that you have installed on your Kubernetes cluster. In my case, I only have one, the Micro K8's host path, and I'm going to enable it so I can, when I deploy applications, use this storage class. Now here I have two more settings, shared access policy and volume expansion. You want to make sure that whatever storage class you're using on your Kubernetes cluster, you can set up these capabilities appropriately. And for this, we have a link where you can check on the Kubernetes documentation page. The features are available for each type of storage class that you can deploy under your Kubernetes cluster. So make sure you read this documentation before playing around with these settings. Otherwise, you might have issues like data loss or data corruption when you deploy your applications. Okay, so I'm going to save these features here. I'm also going to save them here. Let me enable the external load balancer on my business edition of Portainer also. Disable allow resource overcommit and enable the use of this specific storage class for this cluster. Okay. Now there's another thing I want to show you when it comes to namespaces or resource pools. So here, when you add a resource pool or a namespace, it is always good to set a specific amount of resources for this given namespace. Again, to make sure that your application is not going to use more resources than it should and compromise the health of your Kubernetes cluster. I'm going to set up like a 1 gig amount of memory and half a CPU for this namespace. And here we have two more features that are only available on the Portainer Business Edition, and those are Load Balancer Quota and Storage Quota. Okay, so the Load Balancer Quota is an interesting feature because load balancers are good to have under control, mainly because of cost. So here we allow you to set a max amount of load balancers for each namespace to make sure that you have a healthy use of your load balancers within your Kubernetes cluster. I'm going to set up here 5, for instance. And storage quota, well, I think this feature speaks for itself. You want to make sure that this namespace or resource pool is not going to use more than a maximum amount of storage that you would want to define for this given namespace that's going to run here in your Kubernetes cluster. Right. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please stay tuned for our next how-to. Thank you very much.